Well, I sense something of an EU insecurity at the moment, perhaps embodied by French President Emmanuel Macron attacking Brexit in his New Year's address. Joined today by someone who's actually written about this, Alexandra Phillips. Alex, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you doing?
Not too bad at all. No, I just wanted to, I saw your piece on the Telegraph. I just wanted to talk to you a bit about this. What do you make of these comments from French President Emmanuel Macron? For those who haven't seen them, could you please explain what was said?
Right, so basically Macron was saying that Brexit was the child of European malaise, of lies, of basically a big con. And it doesn't surprise us that he says this because, look, we know he's been the EU pin-up boy for a long time. He's a massive Euro federalist almost. And he goes on in his speech to carry on saying that, France and the EU are going to be even better without Britain, basically, because they've got this pooled sovereignty and one looks after the other. But I think he knows that on the horizon, he's got big difficulties from the EU coming to France. For instance, most EU countries are going to be in a big economic disaster, much like we are after the pandemic, but they have to go cap in hand to Brussels before they can start bailing out businesses so it doesn't contravene state aid rules. The EU wants all of the rescue packaging essentially to be channeled through the ECB and through the European Commission, and that will come with stringent limitations and conditions. And I think when Macron then has to go back and essentially impose, a bit like during the Eurozone crisis, austerity on his nation. We've already seen protests up and down the country against the police filming act. We've seen protests during the BLM uprising that went around across Europe. We've seen protests in the wake of the Islamic extremism bill. We've seen protests dating back from 2018 of the Gilets jaunes industrial action, with workers unhappy about the conditions of things like income support and retirement age. And it's exactly those things that Brussels is going to make Macron put back on the table now for the French people in return for being able to bail out businesses. So I think there's a lot of trouble coming down the line. And so he's talking about the fact that France is primarily, number one, a European nation, and its solidarity is pooled with the EU, because that is true. There's not much choice in the matter. But I think you're going to see over the next few months, not just in France, but across the EU in general, a rising amount of Euroscepticism as people are unhappy with the economic situation left in the wake of the pandemic, but also won't be very happy knowing that the hands of their leaders are effectively tied behind their backs.
What do you think it says that the French president feels like in his annual address he has to attack Brexit of, in his words, lots of lies and false promises? What do you think that says about French politics, Emmanuel Macron as president of France, and the EU outlook?
Well, look, what it's basically saying is Macron saying to his own people, don't you dare look across the channel and want some of what they have. It's not on the table. It's not on offer. And he knows he's got to start the PR exercise about the EU now. And Macron's a bit of a deft little leader at times. I would suspect that the horrific optics when he closed the borders to freight between the UK and France following the announcement of a mutant strain, that hasn't been done at all at any point during the crisis, can I just say. Yes, the borders were closed for people to cross, especially at the beginning of the crisis, but we've not seen a ban on freight going between the two countries. And of course that created the horrific optics of queues of lorries stacked up in Kent, families unable to go and join their drivers unable to go and join their families at Christmas, and played in very well to the narrative of this is what could happen with a no-deal Brexit if you haven't got French fraternity on your side. But at the 11th hour, a deal was reached. I don't think that was Macron's decision. If you recall, Michel Barnier, who is Macron's compatriot, a former Minister of Finance in the French government as the negotiator, was actually put on the benches by Ursula von der Leyen, which people suspect was a call coming from Angela Merkel saying, look, we need to get Brexit over the line. She got rid of Barnier. She made sure her one was in there to bat to get a deal done, whereas Macron had been pressuring Barnier in the latter weeks, ramping up demands on the EU, suspecting that the UK would walk away with a no-deal outcome. There would be utter havoc and they would come whimpering back to the negotiating table, but that hasn't happened and he's disappointed.
Yeah, and I must say as well, I mean, something I was pretty disgusted by was Macron's Europe Minister, Clement Beaune, near the end of the transition period, playing politics with that French border closure, even tagging into the post the likes of Marine Le Pen. What do you think this means, Brexit means in terms French politics? Because certainly, as I say, for the Europe minister, Clement Beaune, he seems to want to play politics with this. Macron announcing, talking about it in his address. How do you think this plays out in French and more widely in European politics over the next few years?
Well, we always have had Euroscepticism in France, and anyone who thinks that doesn't exist hasn't clearly visited the country or looked at its politics for the past couple of decades. Look, in the last presidential runoff, it was between Le Pen and Macron ended up beating her easily because, of course, he's able to paint her with unsavory brushstrokes and deter voters from backing her. And I think that when you look at polling right now, the two are neck and neck again, and Remblissement are doing extremely well. Macron lost the most recent elections, the municipal elections and the European elections. He's projected to not do very well in the forthcoming regional elections. It's not necessarily boding well for his party and his presidency, but I think at the end of the day, if it ended up being a straight two-way fight between him and Le Pen, I'm sure Macron would win second time around. But his approval ratings are lower than they've ever been. They're -60, which means 60% of people do not think he's doing a very good job as president. And he's in a very difficult situation because that's only going to get more difficult with forthcoming economic crisis. And I think you're right, the French have played politics with this. We are their closest neighbour, and there's a lot for the UK and France to sort out between themselves. And I think that needs to be sat down in a sort of bilateral concord almost created between the two nations, which is what we've always had since before the EU. Because what we've seen is Germany once again getting their own way in Brussels, and Macron, who was very worried and is still very worried about the prospects for French fishermen once British waters and stocks are repatriated. Of course, that is 5.5 years down the line, and we haven't determined what share of the quota they're going to get. So I don't think that that's a resolved issue at all. But Macron's going to be extremely worried about that. And there was talk of if there was a no-deal Brexit, there'd be blockades and fishing boats would blockade the ferry ports in Calais. And look, all of that hasn't happened. But you're right, Clement Beaune, I think, actually wanted to see a bit of a tricky, difficult end at a very critical moment in, European current affairs, because he wanted to make the point about Brexit and essentially frighten his people into not wanting the same for themselves. But the French situation is extremely different. Of course, we were never in the Schengen acquis. We never had fully open borders with Europe. France shares about 5 land borders with other European nations. And so, when it comes to negotiating exit from the Schengen acquis, that would be very difficult. When you look at being a member of the Eurozone, they're incredibly tied into the ECB, the EIB. They've had to bail out other Eurozone member states. They've got an artificially suppressed currency, which certainly helps them economically, but they can't make very unilateral decisions for what's good for the French economy, because that's all determined centrally by the ECB, things like interest rates and so on and so forth. And now, of course, the European Rescue Fund, which has got its own conditions attached to it. So I think what you're finding is French people are getting more and more upset with their economic situation. It's naturally a sort of left-wing socialist country that's always had a very high level of things like welfare support and early retirement age. And that's all set to change in the coming months. And from previous industrial action we have seen, certainly the Gilets jaunes riots, which involved quite a lot of police violence, if you remember, back in 2018 and 19, was said to be the worst since 1968, when you had a mass uprising that actually saw then President Charles de Gaulle flee the country. So it's not a very pretty situation going on in France economically. That's only set to get worse. And we've seen the emergence of Eurosceptic movements over the past year. And before that, France has always had Eurosceptic movements, but they've largely been very disparate and separated and badly organized. But we've seen the emergence of one, Génération Brexit, about 6 months ago, which I think really wants to set the tone and the mood of the debate in the country. And so we might actually see for the first time a proper membership of the EU debate happen in France. And there's talk that Marine Le Pen is going to have that in her manifesto to offer the French people.
Just more widely, finally, Alex, do you think this is something we're going to repeatedly see now, that the EU true believers like Macron are going to have to consistently and constantly say, well, you don't want Brexit, don't look over there, don't look at leaving the EU, there's no benefits to be had. Do you think this is something we're going to see from the likes of Macron and other European leaders in the years to come as Euroscepticism continues to spread across the European continent?
Well, this is the interesting thing. All the Eurosceptic parties are looking to see what happens with Britain. You've had Norway already complain that our deal with the EU is better than anything they've got. They always complained that they had essentially administration by fax, regulations by fax coming from Brussels, and that they think we've got a far better deal out of them, a thinner deal perhaps, but that obviously suits us as Brexiteers. But what you've got to remember is the words of the EU. Michel Barnier was very clear about needing Britain to look like they have been punished for leaving the bloc. You do not get the benefits of full access to the single market without following our regulations, so on and so forth. And what we've got is a bit of a halfway house on a lot of areas, which frankly is actually not a bad deal considering the legacy Boris Johnson was left with. But this could now perform as a platform, a springboard, would you say, for our independent future as we continue to diverge, or it could draw us back in. Now, what the EU will want to see is if we do continue to diverge, we'll need to be punished for it. So other European nations realise that actually it's far more favourable being inside the bloc, which of course we fundamentally disagree with. So it really matters what Boris Johnson does with the rest of his tenure and what success he makes out of Britain, and the level of divergence that we see happen to really paint a picture for other Europeans about whether Brexit has been a success and whether it's something they want a part of. And I think that what you will see emerge is that pattern. You've got growing movements for leaving the EU, growing Eurosceptic movements in Poland, in Hungary, in Italy, in Spain, in France. Certainly a few of the movements I know are actually conjoining together and working together and thinking of creating a more pan-European movement. For the first time, you've got parties with a Eurosceptic bent forming a big bloc in the European Parliament under the ID group, which we haven't really seen emerge before. So I think without a doubt, things are looking very difficult PR-wise for the EU. But as they always do, they manage to somehow draw more power from crisis situations and get away with doing things that frankly should be unconscionable. Look at the vaccine situation. The EU have prevaricated until now to allow the rollout of the vaccine around member states. And every passing day costs lives. The reason other member states have not been allowed to roll out the vaccine, we've been vaccinating, of course, for a few weeks now. We've passed the millionth person mark. The reason they didn't allow that was for the sake of solidarity, for it looking like they're all in together. I mean, if they're prepared essentially to put lives on the line for the purpose of their image and somehow get away with it, bypass the international critique that you would assume would come with such an outlook and policy, then, you know, you've got to realize they do clearly have the ability to carry on bumbling on crisis after crisis. And whatever comes in the wake of the pandemic, however ugly it may be, the EU's primary purpose will be to preserve itself.
And finally, Alex, if you had to pick one country in the EU now that you really think is the one to watch, that perhaps has the strongest Eurosceptic movement as the next one out the door, if you will, following Brexit Britain, which country would you say people should really be looking at the politics of at the moment?
It depends, because there's very, very different ways to look at that. You can look at particular leaders like Orban, who has been very strict with the EU and said that, you know, we don't want some of these rules and regulations for our country, we want to beat our own path. But then if you look, for example, I mean, Italy was always the one touted to go for an Italexit. They've got an Italexit movement. It's doing very well. But Italy has gone through the process of having bailouts before and is very much tied to the euro, and it's suffered mass crippling austerity and is likely to be the recipient of rescue packages in the post-pandemic world. So if they've managed to weather that storm once before, one would have to ask whether they'd do it again. And the argument will be, this is not the time to be having that debate. We're in a mess. For that reason, I'd actually say France is looking the most likely. Why? Because Euroscepticism has been growing solidly there. They've now got some organized movements, but critically, France is going to be in a mess. Their debt to GDP ratio is the fourth worst in Europe. So that's coming after the basket cases of Greece and Italy and Portugal, who suffered incredibly during the Eurozone crisis, and of course were countries who ended up being bailed out by France. But France itself is now the second highest net contributor into the EU since the UK left, taking its share of contributions, which is equivalent to about 19 member states put together. So not only is France going to be in its own economic crisis, it's going to have a lot of hungry mouths around the table to feed as well, and will not be prioritised, I wouldn't have thought, when it comes to bailout packages. It's already had industrial action. and there's presidential elections coming up. So I think that when those planets align, the narrative is set for a very spicy debate on membership of the EU, on Brexit. And I think that is exactly why Macron used the opportunity of the New Year's Day address to talk about that.
Well, Alex, look, fascinating insight. Great to have you on the channel. I'm sure we'll chat again soon. Alexandra Phillips, thanks so much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.